Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up. My name is Morgan McClintock, and I'm joined today by Chris Albrick. Chris, hi, how are you?
Doing great. Always good to be here. Today,
we're going to be talking about how to develop corporate messaging. But before we get into that, look, check out my new swag. I'm wearing
looking good.
my Fired Up t-shirt. There's a lot of these. If you want to get yours, you can get one in the Firebrand store. You can use the code Firebrand with an 8 instead of the B and get 50% off. I think our graphics designer had a bit too much fun with some of the merch in there. One of them's got my face on it and a big chili. I was like, okay. So maybe I should turn up wearing that. Before we dive into the corporate messaging process, let's just quickly talk about that TechCrunch has just had a bit of a facelift today. Connie Loizos, the managing editor there, got a post about their redesign. What do you think of that, Chris?
I just popped up and took a look, and I think it tallies with what Connie says in her post. TechCrunch for years has had a design that I believe it dates back to the days when TechCrunch was owned by Verizon. And if you use Verizon like I do, you could see a lot of similarities between the Verizon content management system and the website, the consumer, like customer service website, and TechCrunch. And it always felt a bit off. I'm sure that there were some efficiencies on the back end from using a common technology, but the site was definitely showing its age, and it wasn't really delivering a reader experience that was commensurate with the influence of the site.
For those that are on audio, we'll just describe the different things. But for those who are watching on YouTube, you can see the design here.
Yeah, it's really modern. It's a lot more modular. The layout is now familiar to anyone who reads online first news sites like The Verge. It reminds me a little of the gaming site Polygon, which now that I think about it is I believe related to The Verge. It feels modern. It feels clean. We're seeing the outcomes of that management shakeup on the reader experience side. First, we saw some turnover with staffing and a lot of departures, some staff coming in, but you can see that it sounds like this redesign's been in the works for a while, but it's just sort of interesting to see that the changes at TechCrunch are not just manifest in the makeup of the editorial team, but are having sort of outcomes on the experience side as well.
Yeah, and Connie says a lot of the upgrades are on the back end in terms of usability. But for me, if you look across the sort of primary nav there now, you can see what they're interested in. So startups and venture, and Connie has got a strictly VC. She definitely brings that sort of interest in the venture industry as a sort of whole section. But then the other ones are interesting, like Apple. So just a whole segment on Apple, and I guess maybe that's a proxy for some other bigger companies. Amazon's in there if you scroll down through that. AI, probably not a surprise. Security, they do have a number of writers. I think Carly Page just came back from maternity, for example, but, on the security beat, and then apps, sort of a general thing. So those are the areas. They've dropped logistics. They used to do a lot of stuff about ride sharing and that kind of stuff. They've sort of dropped that out of the primary now. And then you can see, I think they're really foregrounding the events. This is where a lot of publications, TechCrunch not included, make their money, right? The Disrupt, etc. The podcasts, they have a lot of podcasts, and I think they're probably trying to showcase them a little bit more. And all the newsletters. I know sort of TechCrunch Plus, which was their subscription newsletter, and what used to be called Extra Crunch, has gone away. But you can really now see all the different newsletters. These are free to subscribe that they have. So you can also see some of the other, I think some of the other changes that they've made have been to the ad units, larger ad units, so they can monetize more clearly. But we wish the TechCrunch guys good luck. I think just makes it cleaner and easier. I'm hoping that they fix the search, because if you've ever used a search on TechCrunch looking for a particular brand or a particular reporter, it's been broken for a very long time. Now, let's talk a little bit about our main topic today, which is how to develop corporate messaging. Chris, at the top of this, when we talk about corporate messaging, what do we mean?
Well, that's a great question because it means some different things to so many different people. So when we talk to clients about it, we usually just start with talking about messaging itself. And we will usually say that messaging is simply what we agree to say about a particular topic. And that seems like almost a tautological definition, right? But once you start drilling down, you see why you need to be that broad about it, because messaging at its highest level is simply agreed speech. But when you get down to corporate messaging, so corporate messaging is what you agree to say about the company and everything that it's trying to accomplish. And in some ways, a messaging exercise is about defining what you don't say as much as it is about defining what you do. It's an exercise in editing and getting everybody in an organization at least roughly on the same page and manifesting that on a literal page so that everybody can see what has been agreed and is left in really no doubt about whether it's okay to say this or not to say that. It's a kind of life preserver in the ocean of media and corporate interaction. You always know that if you're sticking to the agreed messaging, you have nothing to worry about. And that can be a tremendous relief, especially for less experienced spokespeople or people at events who find themselves speaking one way or another on the record, whether it's to partners, customers, or even the media, and they would otherwise feel at a loss to speak because they don't feel like they know what is permissible. With messaging, they can move conversations forward on their own in a way that the organization feels comfortable with.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have consistent messaging architecture. You're a small company. You've all got to be saying the same thing. If a prospect and a customer and somebody in support come in and they talk to different members through their customer journey and they talk to the company and they feel like they're getting different value proposition at each instance, that can be very confusing. Hey, the salesperson said one thing. Now that I'm using it, I'm feeling a different thing. I call this customer support and they think something even different. You're just fragmenting your efforts when it comes to marketing and that sort of consistency. So what we're trying to do is to develop a corporate sort of message house. That's, messaging architecture. When we say that, what are the different components? Like, what is like a messaging architecture?
You raise an important point here, because not only are there different components to the messaging architecture, which we'll get into in a moment, but a proper messaging exercise will encompass forms of the message for different purposes. Everyone's familiar with the concept of an elevator pitch, right? A summary of the company's purpose and benefits that could be delivered characteristically in the space of an elevator trip. Then you will have more expanded versions that are more suitable for, say, a corporate boilerplate and a press release, and even more expanded versions, which are more suitable for like a pitch to a reporter. But those descriptions of the company and those sort of summaries of the messaging are composed out of elements, including the mission, the company vision. You come up with agreed descriptions for the company. You would be amazed. Well, you wouldn't be amazed, but clients are often amazed how many different ways different spokespeople or stakeholders within the company describe the company. Everybody, it's that old story about the blind person and the elephant, right?
Yeah.
The different people within an organization see it a different way. You want to understand what category of product or service you're delivering, what your value proposition is, what your differentiation is. You want to come up with a snappy tagline for use in press releases and marketing material. You want to have a coherent description of your key products. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you want to put that all together into a paragraph long boilerplate, which can be used in press releases.
Those are the critical components. I think it's really important that you go through a process to write them down. Like, it's not enough for us to say, hey, we all know this, so it's fine. You've got to capture them at this moment in time. Now, you're going to need to update this, and we'll talk about that, the frequency of that. But a process of corporate messaging is a snapshot of how we describe the company with all those different elements. And so I think sometimes mission and vision get confused. And so I just want to talk about that. And ideally, at its inception, the mission and the vision are developed, right? Like, this is what, we're trying to do. And those things shouldn't change every 6 months. Those should be long-term endeavors. But what do we mean by mission, and how is it different than the vision?
That is a question that often confuses even PR professionals, marketing professionals, and confuses maybe the wrong way to put it. It's just that the line between them is subtle, right? And not everybody will draw it the same way. Here's how we draw it. We think of the mission as the thing that the organization is trying to accomplish in the world, what it is trying to bring about in the world. The vision is the change that the thing you're trying to bring about will make in the larger universe. So if we take the idea of mission literally, maybe we imagine a mission to Mars, right? If your company is building a rocket, well, your mission is to build a rocket that is capable of transporting people to Mars. But the vision you have is of a future where humanity lives on multiple planets and is no longer bound to the fate of only one, right? That's a sort of, Elon Musk style vision for humanity. So you can see that the vision is it is higher level. The mission feeds into the vision. The vision's what you're trying to bring about in the future. The mission is the way you're doing it.
Right. I think that's nice and clear. And if you look online, you'll see people often reverse those or get them confused. Humankind is trying to be multiplanetary. And in order to do that, our mission is to build a rocket that can take us to Mars. And we'll know when we've reached the mission. And then maybe our company will have a different mission. But we are working towards that mission. And then we've got various milestones on that path. And I think if you think about it like that, it makes it very clear. So have those. And look, sometimes we work with clients to help them define those two things because they've never really codified them. But I do think that this is the thing which is emotional and exciting. This is the why of the company. This is why we're doing what we're doing. So make the vision big and make the mission audacious and long-term so that you can capture some excitement from all of your audiences, your staff, the media, your customers. Like, we're going to Mars, people. This is exciting. And I think something like that, it's sort of important. And if you have your mission just be a very sort of small thing, I don't think you kind of get that emotional response. So mission, vision, company description, value proposition, various descriptions of 50, 100 word, etc. Product description, the boilerplate, ideally a tagline or strapline, sometimes it's called, and what makes you different. And then you can add in some different proof points. There are lots of frameworks out there that you can kind of look at to sort of fill in. Unlike other companies, we are So just find those and fill it in. But the most important is to sort of build this messaging house. But let's talk about that, right? We've got our framework. We know what we're trying to do, but how do we actually do it? What's the first step?
The first step is to figure out who you need to consult in this project. A messaging exercise is so much more than a creative exercise. It's an exercise in organizational change, in change management in a lot of ways. So anyone who's gone through a messaging revamp will know that organizationally it can be very fraught because everybody has an opinion about what the company is, what it's doing, how best to describe it. That shows up most vividly in, I think, Morgan, you described it as a brand projection exercise, which is sort of a sub exercise within messaging where you get various stakeholders to compare the organization to some kind of consumer product, like a brand of clothing or a car. And it can be incredibly revealing to see how radically different people within the organization, like the different car, like someone will say, our car is some kind of value oriented sedan. And often it's the salespeople who pick, like, they see the car as some kind of high end, like hot rod, like really expensive luxury sports car. And it explains a lot about the divergences in the way different people within an organization tend to talk about the company. Now, that's not in and of itself necessarily a bad thing, because part of the reason you get these divergences is that different people within the company are talking to different audiences that do need to hear at least slightly different things. So one of the challenges of a corporate messaging exercise is to incorporate all those different points of view and come up with a synthesis of them that is not just a bland middle point between all of them, because that's in some ways the worst possible outcome. What you're trying to do is pick the best and most effective elements of each of them and synthesize them into a more effective whole.
Yeah. So we sort of break this process out into sort of 3 stages. The first part, and this is what you're sort of referring to, is sort of a discovery part. Like, what does everybody think? Then we have a development part, and then we have a deploy part. So, 3 stages. It keeps it simple. They all begin with D. So discovery then is, you're literally talking to the stakeholders, and they should be the CEO, the CRO, the head of product, anybody that you think in your organization that has a strong opinion. Often means the sort of executive team, but it can extend out to customers as well if you've got the time. And it's during this sort of interview phase that you're asking about, if this was a car, what kind of car would it be? And how would you describe the company? And it's really very quickly you realize, oh, these things are not aligned. Or others, you're like, oh, actually, there's a lot of commonality here, and that's really good, and you sort of build on that. But, you shouldn't just limit the discovery to the people that you're in the organization. Look at what the media has said. Look at what's in your current messaging on the website. Look at what search terms people are coming to your website for. Look at analysts. Like, what are analysts saying about your business? Try and get a 360-degree perspective on the business so that you can, even look at competitors. What are competitors saying? Like, because you can't, if they've claimed that position, you can't be the same position. Like, if they're the cheapest, you can't also be the cheapest, right? Or you need to go head to head, like consciously be going head to head with them. But, you're trying to find a space that's different from them. So the discovery phase is really important, and it can be long, it can be short, but it absolutely must involve, at a minimum, talking to all the key people in the executive team.
Right. All the stakeholders that, if you are really honest with yourself, will need to be consulted about direction on what to say, because messaging is so personal in a lot of ways. And people have signed up, senior executives, any employee, but senior executives in particular, they're going to identify very strongly with the company, and they have strong feelings about what it's for, how they talk about it, what it's about. And they're not going to take well to having a conception of the business that they don't agree with forced on them. The trick in an exercise like this is to bring in the people you need to, and absolutely no more than that, because it's very easy to get into a too many cooks situation. And that is where it's really helpful for the agency to collaborate with their counterpart on the marketing team, someone who understands the internal situation at a company and sort of is savvy enough to realize we better bring this person in, we better bring this person in, but also to say, I think we should cut it here, because otherwise there's just going to be too many voices in the conversation.
At least 4 people in the room, often 6, no more than 10.
Oh, gosh.
because that's really getting up there. So anyone who's got a right of veto over this, they need to be in it. So the sort of development part of this is having spoken to everybody and captured that. There's a sort of synthesis to look at what are the main themes. There's this is what we're doing as the third party coming in to sort of develop and codify this and sort of do the thinking work. Maybe this is the framework to fill in that message house. These are the words that we're going to put on paper. Are they cohesive? Do they work? Do they really capture everything that we've said? What should we include? What can we consciously ignore or sort of exclude because it's a given or it's too much? Like often messaging, we're just trying to capture absolutely everything. It becomes too bland. So then there's normally a workshop, a meeting where we present the messaging and you get those people around the room. This is why I went like sort of 4, no more than 10, like in that meeting to sort of discuss it and see how it resonates. And this is where you really see the dynamics within the group.
I just want to, clarify that before that meeting, typically we will have interviewed the different stakeholders. The way that we come up with that presentation is that we've done individual interviews with each of these senior executives to try to see what sales has to say, see what finance has to say, and so forth. We synthesize all of that input and present it back to them. You mentioned competitive differentiation. I tend to find that that is the area that the stakeholder group often finds just utterly fascinating because they have a feel for how their competitors are presenting themselves. But when we show back to them the research on the latest, on the taglines they're using, the market initiatives they're undertaking, it can be very revealing because especially at the startup level, everybody is heads down. They're just cranking away, just trying to hit that next milestone. And it's difficult to keep track of what the market is doing and how they're positioning themselves. And so there can be some really illuminating moments when they realize, oh my gosh, we were about to launch this whole initiative, which is just, if we succeed at it, we're just going to find ourselves in the place where one of our competitors has landed 6 months ago. We're going to be in messaging terms, maybe even product terms, months behind the competition. If we hadn't undertaken this, we really wouldn't have figured that out.
Yeah, it can be quite a realization. And also there's always that one competitor, right, with great messaging, but in practice, they can't deliver it. And that always creates quite a lot. They're like, well, but they're saying this and we actually do this, but they always say it and we hear it all the time. And they're just the noisy. There's always one. So if you feel like you've got one in your sector, you're not alone. But yeah, that's a critical meeting. And it could be a couple, right? Because trying to get everybody around the room, this often goes in a couple of phases. You sort of have a couple of go-arounds. What did you like? What didn't you like? And you try and come up with something that everybody agrees on. And, I've certainly been in meetings where there have been differences entirely in the whole strategy and what people think about their actual value proposition, almost as if, hey, wait, have you guys even been in a meeting together? Have you met? Because I'm just replaying what you both said and it's diametrically different, which is useful, right? You don't want to find out those strategic differences in the messaging process, but they existed before. And this is just where they've sort of come to the surface. And so we've actually had a few times companies go, okay, look, clearly we've got some work to do. And they sort of take a step back and then come back to the messaging because they want to get better alignment. So rare, but it happens, quite sort of cathartic, I guess, in that sense. So there's the discovery. Then we've talked a bit about the development, and the development is an iterative process there. And then you're sort of into deployment, and deployment means putting it on the website, right? That messaging is going to go in the hero on your website. It's going to go in your press releases, in the boilerplate, and be sort of reflected in the content. You're going to need to update your marketing collateral, like all the touch points. You gradually need to sort of roll it out. And normally we sort of prioritize the most important ones and sort of then just sort of work down. And often it's a sort of a refresh of all those materials. But I do want to make sure this is an important part, because you go through the discovery and the development, and here it is in this document might be, in a deck or something. This doesn't matter until the prospects and your audience see it. So it actually needs to be rolled out and sort of start to resonate. So, it's a bit of a process. Chris, how long do you think it normally takes? Like that sort of discovery and development, those two phases. I mean, deployment can take weeks, months, right? Depending on the size of the company. But how long do we normally allow for the first couple of pieces?
Typically, if you are interviewing 6 stakeholders, you're really looking at a month to get from kickoff to interviews to development of the messaging to presentation of the messaging and sign off on it. As an agency, you're always prioritizing speed, right? I'm trying to balance that with what we've actually seen in practice. So under the right conditions, if everybody was teed up exactly right, you could probably get it done faster than a month. But typically wrangling executive time, it can even take longer. It depends what time of year you're doing it. Are people on vacation? It's not usually like a quick couple week project. A possible exception to that would be in very small companies where there are really just 1 or 2 decision makers. You're working directly with the CEO, maybe, and it's really easy to get alignment. But I would say to budget for the development, the discovery and develop period, at least a month, just to be safe.
And I think you've got to have some time to sort of absorb it and sort of walk around in it a little bit and go, okay, does this really work? And walk away from it and come back to it. So yeah.
You're absolutely correct that deployment, if you're talking about web materials, marketing materials, that sort of thing, that can take months. But it doesn't mean that you're not seeing the benefits of deployment earlier than that. Because, for instance, for your PR teams, new messaging could be deployed more or less instantly. Press releases, the new messaging could be incorporated basically within 24 hours. Certainly swapping in a new boilerplate is not a major exercise. Getting to grips with new messaging for purposes of, like, say, writing a press release might not be automatic, but it certainly doesn't take months to get going. It's really more when you're thinking about trickling down the messaging across all of your marketing channels, especially when you have a website involved. That's what would typically take longer. And often a business will couple, or the trigger for a messaging revamp will be a website revamp. So the two are often coordinated.
Yeah, which is often tied into funding as well. You have to do a sort of messaging light exercise to kind of update it, refresh it, get it out there in time for the funding, new launch and thing, and then sort of circle back. So I think our approach is sort of very much be pragmatic rather than a purist. We don't want some kind of existential, we're going to walk away into the, wilderness and discover who we are and come back. Let's be practical about this. How long do you think that this messaging will last? How often should people revisit? I've got my messaging house. How often do I take a look at it?
I wish there was a simple answer to that, but the truth is it depends. I would be surprised if your messaging didn't last you at least a year. Changes in messaging reflect changes to the company. If you've never done it before, then it's going to be a whole thing. But if you have done it, then the question is, how often do you need to modify it? It will depend largely on how fast the company itself is changing and how fast the market around it is changing.
Yes.
So if you are in a fairly mature, sedate market where you're just trading heavyweight blows with other well-established competitors, you probably won't have to change your proposition or your messaging much at all. But if you are in a market where you or your competitors are frequently pivoting, or if the needs of the market are quickly evolving and you think one year you think that you are addressing this need and this set of customers, but then a year later you realize you're addressing a different need and a different set of customers. Well, you will need to update your messaging then. And the greater the change in your market or your company, the greater the change in the messaging, the more involved the change will be. But typically, even with startups, you don't really need to do a messaging refresh for at least a year, but it's always good to review the need on an annual basis and ask yourself, and, ideally in consultation with some kind of outside perspective like an agency can provide. Like, say, is this messaging still working? Is it doing the job that it was doing for us a year ago?
If you're an AI infrastructure company, your messaging and your market is evolving very rapidly. So you're going to need to update that on a very regular basis compared to if you're a storage company, because there's not such a rapid evolution in terms of the way people store data. But when there are major milestones, definitely take a look at this. And, you can change it. So let's just talk about critical success factors here, like what makes the process go well. And I'll start. I think one of them is speed. Like, the advantage of having a third party come in here is because they can drive the process and they can be that third party lens to kind of align people. And they can do some of the thinking work and the research because you're doing your day-to-day job. And it is useful to have that. But getting it done is important because you got to update it and then you've got to roll it out and sort of building some momentum into it. And we've seen sometimes companies can kind of stall out because it's hard to get that management team together and they weren't quite aligned, and it never really gets sort of finalized. So it's just a slide deck or a Google Doc at this point, and it needs approval to be able to get out. And how do you get to that? Just through building momentum. So when things sort of slow down, choose the time of year when people are going to be around, like just in a practical sense, what is a good moment to sort of choose it, build some momentum and get it done. That's one of the critical success factors for me.
I would fully agree with that. I mean, just a bit earlier, we were saying a project like this can take a month, or you should budget a month for it, and it can easily take longer. That might sound like a long time, but anyone who's tried to do a really serious messaging revamp in-house knows that these projects can extend for quarters because they just get pushed aside for what seem like more pressing concerns. Messaging feels sometimes internally like a nice to have rather than a must have. And then what happens is you end up feeling the need for it when in situations where you realize it's lacking, and then you desperately wish you had it. So that's just all to say that speed is important, and a month is comparatively fast for a project like this.
Another one of mine here is try not to sort of get too down a rabbit hole in terms of wordsmithing. Like, if only we could come up with the mot juste to describe what we would do and why we're different, then that is the unlock for a ton of future success, because the world doesn't work like that, right? So come up with a framework, come up with messaging that works and that you're comfortable with and that you can go to market with. It might be imprecise. It might not capture absolutely every facet of the business that you like, but hopefully it sort of gets you into the conversation, and whatever the stakeholder is, you can then sort of draw those other differentiators out. But just sort of being in those sessions where we're trying to come up with 3 or 4 words that capture everything and we're reordering them, the process can die in that ditch. And so there's sort of a certain amount of being relaxed about, okay, let's try this, and then go out there and test it and come back. If it doesn't feel natural, I'll own it. We've come up with words and I've gone, this looks great in the presentation. And you go out and you're like, yeah, but I say it and it just isn't a thing that someone would say.
Or you find out it doesn't look right on a website. And that's why it's important to have different versions of it that are even mocked up for the different purposes that you plan to use it for. Because messaging that works perfectly well in, say, a PR pitch looks ridiculous on a website. Like, copywriting is its own art. And there is an art to coming up with language that looks good in large type on 2 or 3 lines. And you can't just assume that the sentence that you've come up with as your company description is going to be right for your homepage. So that is absolutely a good point. That while you can't get hung up on the wording, you need to be selective and thoughtful about the wording, but you can be selective to a fault. And the other mistake that organizations and agencies even often fall into is the temptation to satisfy everyone in the room by including all their input. And that's how you get these company descriptions or these boilerplates that are just unreadable mishmashes of offerings and benefits. Everybody has their little pet project or their hobby horse that they want to see in there. And so you end up constructing a sentence or a paragraph that is grammatically correct, but functionally unusable. So one of the benefits that an outside agency or an outside party can provide is that perspective that says, no, you need to cut here. We recommend you cut here. And that might mean that not everyone in the room sees their concerns explicitly represented in the text. But I can tell you from my work as a reporter that one of the greatest challenges of writing news was saying anything without saying everything. Like, you quickly come to realize that in order to say anything at all, you need to leave out many things you could have said that are perfectly true. You could argue are perfectly important, but the function of editing is to make a decision about what details are most salient, most important for the purpose that you have at the moment. And those can be hard decisions. And all too often, what you can see by reviewing other organizations' messaging is that in the room, they didn't make the hard decisions.
Yeah.
They decided to keep everybody happy. And the result of that was messaging that could get approved in the moment, but doesn't actually accomplish what they had hoped functionally. It doesn't advance their competitive positioning. It doesn't provide a coherent description of the benefits and differentiators of the company. It's all language that is technically correct and functionally worthless.
Right. So example, you're an e-signature company, like a DocuSign or a HelloSign or what they call Dropbox Sign. You need to make sure that it says e-signature and we're not some kind of AI contract intelligence platform. Like, wait, what? I've come here because I want to do e-signatures. That's what people are expecting. Let's make sure that we've got that, because no one's out there looking for a contract intelligence platform. That's just a thing that pleased the guy that wants AI and the person that says, yeah, but we do all this analytics, and the person that says, yeah, but what about our storage that's so safe? And you end up with just a jumble. It means nothing. What sort of pleases everyone to a little bit, but means nothing to any of your stakeholders. So I think that's great advice. So just as we sort of come to the end here, Chris, how do you know if your messaging is working? How do you know if you've done a good job?
Well, you see that play out differently in every person who communicates in the organization will experience good messaging differently. They will find that whatever KPIs they're using to track the effectiveness of their communication, they will find that those KPIs improve. I am mainly involved in media pitching. That's my specialty. That's what I do at the agency, right? So what I would find is that with good messaging, as opposed to bad messaging, is that I have an easier time getting reporters to understand what we're doing and how we're different. And I have a easier time getting reporters to take an interest in the company. Truth be told, because my job is to get reporters interested in the company, if I don't have official messaging that is going to get the job done, I'm going to come up with a version of it that I will get approved with my marketing contact that will do the job. But that's not an option for stakeholders in the organization that have to work through more public channels like a website or like a marketing, like an ebook or something like that. They need to stick to the official messaging. And messaging is one, it's not the only element in a successful marketing program, but it is one of the elements. And it is, I would say, a core element of a successful marketing program. And so if your messaging is good, it will improve your marketing program across the board in ways that are measurable.
Yeah, I think you raised an important point. Look, press messaging is different than your corporate messaging because the press are not buying the product. They are an audience that are buying something different, than the benefits and the outcomes that you get from using your product. So the press message is always going to sort of pivot off, and it'll be the same company, but it'll emphasize different things. But I think if your messaging has gone right, because I've seen it in the room. Everyone's excited. They're all aligned. This is our company. What this is captures why we're doing it, what we're doing. It works for us today. It represents our proposition today, but it is also something a little bit aspirational that we sort of can grow into. So it's gonna help us with our sort of map going forward. So I think if you get it right, you can feel it, and it really adds that sort of cohesion to all of your marketing, and it makes sure that you're pointing everything in the same direction. Because remember, we've got limited resources. We need to be as cohesive and aligned as possible. And I think it can really energize a brand when you get this right. And you can get it right by going through these 3 stages: the discovery, development, and deployment at pace, and involving all the critical people and going into it and making sure that we're being as collaborative as possible to make it happen. When you get that right, it really is magical and it's exciting. And honestly, as an agency, it's a real sort of privilege to be part of that. And so I've always really enjoyed it. Chris, listen, thanks for your time today. Really enjoyed going through that. It's fun to swap a few notes about TechCrunch, but then sort of dive deeply into the sort of corporate messaging. And thanks to you all for listening. Thanks for your time. We'll see you all again next week. So Chris, thanks a lot.
Thank you.